Mano, take it away.
All right. Who of you was not here for my previous presentation? All right. Okay, so I'll do the introduction quickly. My career path was not very traditional. I started off as a business consultant, studied statistics and economics. Realized quickly on that career path that that was the prestigious thing, more like what my parents wanted, whereas I was dying at white-collar office work. So I started doing what I was really passionate about, set up my own business, Bayesian bodybuilding, got into fitness, personal coaching. That went really well, and Bayesian bodybuilding is now a 7-person company. It's not just me anymore. I've got a whole research team. Miguel is interning for us. Thomas works for Bayesian bodybuilding. I still do full-time coaching, but we mainly focus now on the educational aspect, so which is also why we're here. We are on social media. We post a lot of studies. And we have a personal training certification program. And tonight I'm going to do just that. Educate you about what makes muscle grow. And the 3 factors here that people are probably familiar with. If you've been reading some exercise science, metabolic stress, muscle damage, and mechanical tension. Those are basically the 3 contenders that we have. And they come from Schoenfeld's publication. Brad, seriously, a round of applause for Brad Schoenfeld. That guy has done more for exercise science than any other exercise scientist. There is no one in the literature that has done so many relevant studies as Brad, seriously. So I wept like a little squirrel girl when this came out. That's how awesome this paper was. And it was the first time that there was, beyond just some description of mechanical tension, actually a pioneering work, a comprehensive mechanistic model of muscle growth. But at the time it was largely theoretical. There was a lot of in vitro research that it was based on. So I think now is the time to revisit that model. So, 3 contenders, starting with mechanical tension. Mechanical tension. All right, let me first give you a quick cliff notes of how muscle grows. What we really know with a lot of certainty, if you open any kind of good review paper, you'll find this as a mechanism of how muscle grows. It starts with mechanotransduction, which means that a mechanical stimulus, the tension on muscle fibers, so you flex them, there's tension, and this gets translated into a chemical signal. That's mechanotransduction. Step 2 that occurs is myogenic signaling. This is basically the signals that start the process of muscle growth. Myogenic, genesis from creation, myo meaning muscle from Greek, and IGF-1, interleukin 6, so that's insulin-like growth factor 1, those are important factors here. They get released and they function as a signal for, hey, okay, this mechanical tension here, we need to jack things up. And then there's this mTOR enzyme, which is like a master enzyme that resides in muscle tissue, and it integrates all these signals. So it looks at your insulin-like growth factor level, interleukin 6, it detects the presence of amino acids, and it integrates all of these signals, and it then starts a translation initiation, which is basically literally the translation of these signals for your genes to initiate, to start muscle growth. After this, you get the actual process of muscle growth, which in large part is muscle protein synthesis. Damaged muscle fibers get removed, the muscle proteins, and new ones are rebuilt. Damaged ones get repaired. This is largely the actual process of muscle growth. The increase in myofibrillar, to be specific, muscle proteins that get added onto the tissue, which makes your muscles bigger. And another thing that occurs here is myonuclear addition, because as Birgit talked about, there seems to be a limit of how big a muscle can get based on how many nuclei are in a muscle fiber. So you can think of a muscle fiber as like a patch of, or an area, and it has these command centers in it. Those are the nuclei, which contain DNA. And there's a limit to how big you can get the city or the area based on the number of command centers. So you need additional command centers, which is myonuclear addition, the formation of these new nuclei, to get a bigger total area. And here's a graphical overview of what I just said. So it starts with mechanotransduction. There's a mechanical stimulus, stretch or muscle contraction. This disrupts muscle fibers, gets translated into chemical signals. And there's translation initiation. The signal goes to your genes, your DNA, which has the blueprint to form all these muscle proteins. It gets the right message to which kind of proteins have to be formed. There's muscle protein synthesis and myofibrillogenesis, so muscle growth. All right, so first one, undisputed, very clear. There's really no contesting that mechanical tension is a possible driving force of muscle growth. Now here's where things get more controversial. Let's look at muscle damage. What is muscle damage? It's basically simply tearing. All of the tissues in muscles, membranes, the muscle fibers, pretty much everything there at the cellular level, it can tear, it gets disrupted. So here on the right, you can see that literally if you look at muscle tissue after exercise and in resting condition, it looks nice and neat when you haven't exercised, and after exercise, it looks grainy and torn up and worn down. So that's literally what happens when you're exercising. Now on the left here, I have the process of muscle damage in a bit more detail. So it starts with quiescent satellite cells. Basically, they're sleeping, they're just chilling. And then there's muscle damage and satellite cell activation. So this tearing that you see over there, there you have IL-6, TNF-alpha also involved in inflammation signaling. The immune system is activated. Then there's an inflammatory response that starts the muscle repair process. So things get patched up. It's okay, things are holding back together again. Anti-inflammatory response from the immune system again, and here we are whole again. Repaired myofiber, so the muscles are whole, and satellite cells, they can self-renew. Now you don't have to understand the nitty-gritty details of this, just know, get a rough overview of what occurs during muscle damage and subsequent repair and muscle growth. Now let's look at some actual evidence on the relation between muscle growth and damage. Most people here in this room should know that correlation does not imply causation, but if there's causation, there should be correlation. Logically, it's possible to have causation without correlation, but it's an exceptionally complicated, rare scenario. So let's look at if muscle damage correlates with muscle growth. And there was a really cool study by Damas that did this. And they basically found that muscle damage correlates with muscle protein breakdown, but not muscle growth. So here's what they did. Measure myofibrillar protein synthesis and muscle damage, so muscle growth, muscle damage. In 10 young men, they performed strength training, they actually lifted. What did they do exactly? Okay, subjects had some experience, okay, they did strength training, they did lower body training, and you had myofibrillar protein synthesis, muscle damage, well, technical details of how they measured muscle growth and muscle damage. And here you can see, if you look at muscle protein synthesis, that it appears like when damage was really high, there's also more muscle protein synthesis. However, in figure B, we correct for muscle damage and look at myoprotein synthesis, so the amount of muscle growth, and it's flat. There's no more significant effect over time. So in spite of different levels of muscle damage from the start to the end of the experiment, actual muscle growth over time was pretty linear. Results, more specifically, muscle protein synthesis was significantly higher at T1, but is vanished when correcting for muscle damage. Basically, when you have damaged muscles, there's more protein down, and there might also be more protein synthesis, but it's just to repair the damaged muscle tissue. And it appears that this muscle damage, it triggers new muscle growth, but it doesn't trigger any net muscle growth. It's just the repair of the tissue. So there was no correlation between any marker of muscle growth or muscle damage. However, there was a significant correlation between muscle protein synthesis and actual muscle growth, which is to be expected as muscle protein synthesis is an integral part of the muscle growth process. So this study or cast a lot of doubt on the relevance of muscle damage for muscle growth. It actually makes it appear like muscle damage is more of a byproduct that we want to avoid. It extends the recovery period because there's more muscle that needs to be repaired, and it doesn't actually aid muscle growth. Okay, one study. Let's look at this from a few different angles. Another study looked at 2 different kinds of programs that varied in the amount of muscle damage that the program did, and then see if it correlated with muscle growth. So, study objective, test if muscle damage was necessary for hypertrophy in young untrained males and females. How did they do it? They had a pre-trained and a naive group. So basically what they did is that the pre-trained group had 3 weeks of working up to the program, so that the repeated bout effect occurred, as it's called, and they didn't experience a lot of muscle damage. You can find this out for yourself in the gym. If you gradually work up to a certain weight, you're not going to be sore as hell and need a lot of time to recover because you gradually work up to it. But if at once you go on a completely new program, do super high volume of some new exercise, you're going to be sore as fuck the next day. So try split squats. That's a really good one. So you get that nice moment when you sit down on a toilet and you're like, yes, yesterday was split squats. So back to the study design. Total training volume was the same in both groups. So the one group, they worked up to it, and the other group, they went right into the program. Now what happened is exactly what I just said. The group that worked up to it didn't have a lot of muscle damage, but the other group, they got a lot of muscle damage, and they needed some time before this disappeared. And the amount of muscle growth between groups, again here, muscle damage, pretty constant over time in the pre-trained group, but in the group that just went all in from the start, it started off really high, and they were really sore. Same total work, and same total muscle hypertrophy. So there was no relation between the muscle damage here and muscle growth. In other words, the naive group experienced significantly more muscle damage with up to 5 times the increase in creatine kinase. In addition, at week 4, perceived soreness was significantly elevated in the naive group. Both groups experienced increases in strength and size equally, with increase in muscle volume and strength. So basically 2 programs differing in the amount of muscle damage that they did, same growth. Again, seems to suggest no relation between muscle damage and muscle growth. Let's look at a different angle, eccentric exercise. It's long believed that eccentric exercise is superior for muscle growth than concentric exercise, and it's probably true to some extent. We also know that eccentric exercise does a lot of muscle damage. So there it seems like there is a correlation. Eccentric exercise, more muscle growth and more muscle damage than concentric exercise. For those that don't know, an eccentric contraction is a lengthening contraction. So during the bench press, it's when the weight goes down, and a concentric contraction is when the weight goes up, with most free weight exercises at least, and the muscle shortens. So is this actually true? Again, a study by Brad Schoenfeld et al. Quite possibly. They did a meta-analysis and they found that there wasn't a statistically significant effect, strictly speaking, but there was a trend. However, the effect size was pretty low, so there wasn't a major effect. Now, most of this literature was not controlled for total work. And we know that during eccentric contractions, a muscle is a lot stronger. In fact, the difference can be pretty huge. So if we only look at studies where total work was equated between groups, so taking into account that eccentric contraction you are stronger than during a concentric one, so you don't have to do the same amount of sets or repetitions. Moore and Phillips did this. There was no difference in muscle growth, which seemed to suggest that it's the volume, the extra volume you can do, basically the mechanical tension, and not the muscle damage necessarily, that might explain why you get more growth from eccentric exercise. Hawkins et al. Did find that eccentric exercise resulted in more muscle growth than the concentric group, but they controlled for volume a priori, which means that they did it from the start. They didn't actually measure the amount of work done between the groups. They just estimated, okay, we need to do about 25% more work in the concentric group. And they based that off literature showing that it's about 20% difference, but that was in men. And this study was in women. And in women, we actually know that's more like up to 60%, and we actually have research showing a 161% greater strength in women during eccentric muscle contractions, which means that this study probably didn't really fully control for total work. So basically, this is also a highly inconclusive point for any role of muscle damage for growth. It seems to be, or it might very well be, that's just the total amount of work that you do, and not muscle damage specifically. Let's look at another angle. Speaking of the ladies, women experience a lot less muscle damage after training, or a lot less, but they get the same growth. And for those that are like, wait, what? Yes, women actually have the same muscular potential as men relative to their starting point. I'm not going into that in detail. You can find that article, Natural Muscular Potential of Women, where you can see all the references and stuff. But this is, for our purposes here, another point where we see that people with less muscle damage than another group of people, men and women, but they get the same amount of muscle growth from similar strength training protocols. Again, not being in line with a very simple role of muscle damage causing muscle growth. Another nice one, blood flow restriction exercise. Berge also talked about this. It's been brought up a few times already during this summit. Okay, here's a research review. In the interest of time, we'll look at that later, but it's like an 8-page document from a PT course with every study on KAATSU. So probably don't want to go into every study individually. But the gist of it is this. If you look at low versus high intensity training, so high reps with KAATSU versus traditional heavy strength training, one group just did heavy benching, for example, and the other group did bench presses with blood flow restriction cuffs on and very high reps. We see that they get similar muscle growth, but KAATSU training, so blood flow restriction training, occlusion, does not nearly the same amount of muscle damage. In fact, when KAATSU was first investigated, it was thought that there was no muscle damage at all because it was so hard to detect. So we see that you can get similar rates of muscle growth with KAATSU as normal heavy strength training with not nearly the same amount of muscle damage taking place. Now, metabolic stress comes in here, which we'll discuss in a bit, but again, it's not consistent with a very strong role for muscle damage. We also know that at the same intensity, you can increase muscle growth, but you don't decrease muscle damage by implementing KAATSU. So we have two groups. They both work with, say, 30% of their 1RM. One group adds occlusion, and one group does it without occlusion. Then the group with the occlusion will probably, and in this study did, get more muscle growth. Whereas they don't get more muscle damage. So again, we see this discrepancy between how much muscle damage there is and how much muscle growth. All right, this is a nice one. Creatine actually reduces muscle damage. Not super consistently, but it generally decreases it or leaves it pretty much the same. Few mechanisms here by which this can occur. Decreases in oxidative stress, possibly. We know it suppresses inflammation. It might upregulate the calcium pump, which can protect the integrity of the tissue. And we know it increases satellite cell activation, which can also help reduce muscle damage. So what we see is that it seems to reduce muscle growth or muscle damage, yet it actually improves muscle growth. Creatine is pretty much the only supplement where we can say with a high degree of confidence that in people that respond to it, because sadly not everyone does, it's pretty much as good as it gets for a legal supplement that's going to get you jacked. If you're not impressed with creatine, there's no magic pill on the market. HMB, right. Oh, actually, I notice I have a Jacob Wilson reference here. I'm not sure if that even counts anymore, right? All right. It's the same story for citrulline. Seems to reduce muscle damage. Hasn't been any study yet showing it actually increases muscle growth, but at least supplement companies think it does. Maybe similar to creatine here. So, mechanisms of muscle growth revisited, muscle damage rejected. There's not a compelling rationale at the moment that muscle damage is a factor that actually increases muscle growth. In fact, it seems to be more the case that it might be detrimental because we know it can extend recovery times. We know it increases protein breakdown. So what I found with Berge, and this is a bit going into tomorrow's talk on high frequency training, but I originally was a proponent of more muscle damaging techniques in training. And I started implementing high frequency training because Berge got me onto it. And I used to be of the mind that you need more, like fewer sessions with more overload per session. But the key to making it work in my clients was reducing muscle damage, not using these advanced techniques that do a lot of muscle damage and keeping volume down per session. And then I got a lot better results with high frequency training. But again, I will go into detail tomorrow. For now, let's look at factor number 3, metabolic stress. Here I actually outlined the theoretical rationale better for why metabolic stress might be a factor that causes muscle growth. So we know it induces cellular swelling, which might, at least theoretically, induce muscle growth. It increases reactive oxygen species. Inflammation has a very strong role. Myokine production, it activates the immune system in different ways. It elevates certain hormone levels, and it increases fiber recruitment, which increases muscle activity, which obviously can increase muscle growth. All right, so what is metabolic stress? It's the accumulation of metabolic byproducts in the muscle, including lactate, phosphate, hydrogen ion, and hypoxia. All right, problem with this definition is that I love the concept, but it's not quantified. How much metabolic stress is there when there is a certain level of hydrogen ion, but hypoxia is down? Is metabolic stress higher or lower when there's a lot of lactate, but we see phosphate levels go down? Now, in practice, you don't often see these scenarios, but the point is, without a quantified objective measure, we cannot correlate it. So, like we did with muscle damage, we don't have a study on metabolic stress, like Damas et al., that we can actually just see, does metabolic stress correlate with muscle growth? So we have to look at this from different angles. All right, first thing I think with metabolic stress is, where's the muscle growth from high-intensity interval training? We know this induces a shit ton of muscle stress or metabolic stress, and it can also induce a lot of muscle damage, but there's very little growth. And a lot of people are skeptical of that, but in many studies, high-intensity interval training results in zero or very little growth, especially beyond the utter novice level. And people are always like, look at these sprinters, they are fucking jacked. And if you actually look at how Olympic sprinters train, when you're doing your Tabata protocols and you're running for 20 seconds, I trained one sprinter that unfortunately didn't make it to the Olympics. I did his nutrition, but if you spoke of 20-second sprints, he was like, man, that's cardio. That's twice to 4 times what I normally do. Like a 5-second sprint, that's a sprint. 10 seconds, you know, that's pretty long duration. That's as far as I go. So 20 seconds, I don't do 20 seconds. And rest intervals, Tabata's like 20-second sprint, and then 10 seconds you rest. And he was like, after those 10 seconds, I'm out for 5 minutes. I come back later. So I have a donut in between. So it's completely different than high-intensity interval training, training for actual sprinting performance. Not to mention, all of those guys do a lot of strength training. Plus, we know that a lot of studies show that adding high-intensity interval training to strength training actually reduces muscle growth. And again, if you're like, what? Then you should look at the interference effect. Wrote an article on that already called the cardio come down. Not going to go into that in too much detail here. Point here is that we have high-intensity interval training, a method where we see muscle damage, high metabolic stress, very little muscle growth. And that's probably because there's not enough mechanical tension, or not enough time under tension at least. So, rest intervals. This was a huge one for the bro community. Metabolic stress was basically posited in large part as a reason for why bodybuilders should do short rest intervals, and it worked better for strength to have long rest intervals. But we now know, and I wrote a review on this, co-authored by Brad again, and we also followed this up with a study, randomized controlled trial, where we showed that basically in work-equated literature, there's no difference. But if you're looking at people doing a certain amount of sets, like in Buresh et al. And in Schoenfeld's study, then we see that if you have people rest a certain time, long versus short, you do the same number of sets, you actually get more muscle growth when you rest longer. And the reason for that is likely because you simply do more total volume. You do more work. You can do more reps if you've rested longer. So you can put more tension on the muscle fibers. So this was a clear case when bodybuilders were not only just doing something neurotically, obsessively, that you didn't need to do. Maybe you don't need 6 meals a day to get jacked. But this was actually a case where bodybuilders were just flat out limiting their own gains in many scenarios. So it actually seems that generally, at least if you're not overtraining yet, more rest can be productive for muscle growth as well as strength development. And metabolic stress probably doesn't have a big role to play here, because the whole point was that you want short rest intervals to accumulate a lot of metabolic stress. But apparently it doesn't work. Total volume seems to be more important. Another one, the hypertrophy range, 6 to 12 reps. That's supposed to be where the magic happens, because that's where you get metabolic stress and tension. However, there's now a lot of research also showing that higher rep work can be beneficial, but more importantly, as far back as 2002, Campbell showed that when you're equating for total volume again, low reps are just as effective for muscle growth. And we now have a new study even, that's the only one, that found increased muscle growth in a higher intensity group compared to a lower intensity one. The vast majority of other literature finds that low reps are just as effective, no more, no less effective than the magic hypertrophy range when you're equating total work. So it doesn't seem to matter that you get this more metabolic stress at this rep range or higher rep ranges. As long as you get the work in, you can also do it with low reps. Doesn't matter. So again, seems to point towards mechanical tension being key, metabolic stress not having any significant effect. Another one where the bros were flat out wrong, the idea to keep tension on the muscle so that you get a lot of metabolic stress, has been quite thoroughly debunked now. Most professionals agree that full range of motion training should be the default method for muscle growth as well as strength development, and pretty much any other kind of training adaptation you want. You can combine it strategically with partials or isometrics or whatever, depending on your goals. But generally, for most purposes, full range of motion training is king for muscle growth and pretty much anything else. Again, you can write that here on Brett, who unfortunately could not make it to this summit. He should have been here, but again, he couldn't make it. So, all right, next point. Training to failure. We've also seen this come up a few times. When you're training to failure, metabolic stress increases exponentially. There's a huge increase, especially the last few reps and the last rep where you're actually failing a set. There's a huge spike in metabolic stress, especially ammonia levels. They increase exponentially. Most lactate, for example, seems to increase linearly over the set. But we see that there's no or little increase in muscle growth. And most studies that actually just looked at training to failure with versus the same protocol without training to failure, they find that there is no difference. All of these, in fact. But I put no/little here because I don't want to give the impression that you should never train to failure. I think there is value in doing that strategically, but that's something for a different discussion. Point being here is that you would expect this extreme rise in metabolic stress to come with more muscle growth, but we don't see it, often not even in low volume scenarios. Cluster sets, another advanced track technique. Also, Bergen mentioned this in the Oliver study, so I don't want to go into detail on this here, but basically cluster sets are when you rest within the set. So you do, say, I apply this a lot with powerlifters for the deadlift. You do one deadlift, you put the weight down, you take a few deep breaths, you do another repetition. And Oliver found in a few other studies that looked at this, is that this is really, really awesome for strength development and power development. And it doesn't seem to come at the expense of muscle growth. So we see that this method, which allows you to get a lot of work done, it's really good to get a lot of mechanical tension on the muscle fibers and get a lot of total work. But it really reduces metabolic stress a lot, which you can easily feel during cluster sets. You don't get the pump, you don't get the burn, which is associated with metabolic stress. So another point where we see training method doesn't result in nearly the same amount of metabolic stress, still gets you the same growth. All right, buffering agents, similar to what we talked about for muscle damage. Creatine and beta-alanine reduce hydrogen ion accumulation and increase muscle pH levels. It's like acidosis, how acidic the environment becomes, basically meaning there's less metabolic stress. Yet they increase muscle growth, or at least have the potential to. So again, it seems that total work is what matters most, because these things, these buffering agents, creatine and beta-alanine, allow you to do more total work. Yet they reduce metabolic stress. But they still make you more jacked. So, last perspective on metabolic stress is, I think, the most convincing one that there is something to metabolic stress. And that's KAATSU, blood flow occlusion, again. But if you look at the literature, and these are a few excerpts from the overview that I mentioned before. If you look at Farouk et al., there was no effect of blood flow restriction training at 40% of 1RM. So it seems that once you get to about 40%, it may be a bit different range, but about 40%, as long as you're going to failure, you don't need blood flow restriction to make the training effective for muscle growth. You can get the same growth already as long as you push to failure. If you use muscle or use occlusion, you can do fewer reps, you get the same growth, but it's not better. So it's a very conditional effect. It's not like you just add metabolic stress and you get more growth. Now, at 40%, it seems to not matter anymore, but at about 20%, it doesn't matter enough. So at 20%, blood flow restriction training is still not as effective as regular high-intensity strength training at 80%. So it's like 8 reps. You do heavy sets of 8. And at 40%, there is no more effect of the cuff pressure. So again, we see that you can increase the amount of metabolic stress. You tighten the reps up further, induce more metabolic stress, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't result in more muscle growth. So really, it's only about this 30% of 1RM range where blood flow restriction training actually seems to help you gain more muscle. So a very conditional effect, not very compelling along the lines of more metabolic stress, more muscle. Now, furthermore, on KAATSU training, this is a nice study that went sort of under the radar, recently published. Is metabolic stress an independent anabolic stimulus? So what they did, they went to determine whether applying blood flow restriction, which results in metabolic stress, at the end of a single set of arm curls increases muscle hypertrophy. So what they did is they got a bunch of men and women to do training, measured muscle growth. They trained for 8 weeks, and on one side, the control arm, they just did biceps curls to failure, and the other arm did the same thing, but afterwards, not during the set, they applied blood flow restriction. So, you know, people in the gym were probably like, "You're doing it wrong, bro. You should do them at the same time. You should have the cuffs on during your set." What they found was that if you apply the blood flow restriction afterwards, if you look at the results here, muscle growth was either the same or it actually seemed to decrease in the experimental arm. So people that use this protocol, and it seems especially the women, there's some research that women respond more poorly to KAATSU training than men. The women actually lost muscle mass, which you can see here. So this effect, applying blood flow restriction after your training, seemed to actually inhibit your gains, which means that you might think, okay, duh, they did it wrong, so it didn't work. But what it means is that it's not an independent growth stimulus. Just applying more metabolic stress does not increase muscle growth. In fact, for those that went to my presentation on injury management, we know that if you're restricting blood flow with icing or NSAIDs, compression, the Rice method, this can actually hamper the recovery process. So we see here that probably this also hampered the muscle repair process, inhibiting the blood flow, or at least venous blood flow. So this study shows that metabolic stress in itself is not an independent growth stimulus. You need the muscle contraction alongside of it to possibly make it work. Now, number 3 on KAATSU, which is the kicker. KAATSU also works for non-occluded body parts. Common question, and most people are like, duh, of course it doesn't work. If you do bench pressing with the cuffs on, it only works for your triceps, right? Wrong, it works for your pecs just as well. And we see for the squat that it works for your glutes just as well as your thighs. So when you're doing occlusion training with the blood flow restriction reps on, this gets your booty bigger. And then people are like, that doesn't make sense, right? Because the metabolic stress only occurs downstream of the reps. But what it just does, probably, is it makes the exercise more difficult. So you occlude blood flow, it doesn't really matter where you occlude it. It makes the exercise more difficult, which makes muscle activation levels rise higher to compensate. And it's the glutes, the hamstrings, everywhere that this needs to occur. So, really what we know is that metabolic stress increases muscle activation, and that increases mechanical tension. The more muscle activation there is, the harder the muscle is contracting, the more tension. So it might not, even in the case of Katsu, it might not be the metabolic stress that's doing anything at all for muscle growth. It might just be the case that it's just the increased muscle activation which makes you have more metabolic or mechanical tension in the muscle fibers. So, if we put all of this together, then basically the current model is that we have these three factors, which a lot of people use, and these all lead to muscle growth. I think the data are a lot more consistent with a model that just has mechanical tension as the driving force of muscle growth, and mechanical tension as a byproduct of muscle damage. And we know that metabolic stress increases mechanical tension, which can indirectly, but under very specific conditional scenarios, increase muscle growth. But there are no direct lines from muscle damage or metabolic stress to muscle growth. All right, what does this mean in terms of practical application? Progressive overload and total work are still king. They always have been, and training programs that make you get a lot stronger, that implement progressive overload in a smart manner, are still what gets you jacked. So I wouldn't worry too much about other growth pathways or design your program so that you stimulate all these growth factors. Those kind of programs might still work because they're basically a form of undulating periodization or they're a nice form of variety, but you don't need to probably actually aim to get these growth pathways activated. All right, who knows who did? Don't you guys watch House of Cards? It's an awesome series. First 2 seasons at least, then it went down the drain. All right. He had an awesome quote. He said, "Decisions based on emotions are not decisions at all." And I think that nicely sums up basically the whole of bro science, is that people are naturally inclined to do things because they feel a certain way. We chase feelings. You're in the gym, you get a nice pump, you look good in the mirror, you feel the burn, you think this must work. You go home, you feel sore the day afterwards, you think, okay, that must work. It's tangible, you feel something, you get a reaction. It's the same reason why they put foam in your shampoo. Foam doesn't do shit. It's the shampoo that cleans your hair. You don't need the foam. They just put it in there to make it seem like there's something going on. Because if you have non-foamy shampoo, you put it in and you're like, well, okay. But if it's foams, you're like, oh, this shit works. So they also do it with gum, the stuff you brush your teeth with, toothpaste. And a lot of marketing techniques, they make it seem like pre-workouts. They have this, you put it in the cup and then it sort of, you get carbonation effect, like it feels like a witch. Fizzy, yeah, it becomes fizzy. So it's like a witch potion. You see this effect where it gets a nice color, and then you're like, oh yeah, this shit must do something. If it's just like watery and you're like, nothing happened, then you're not convinced it does anything. Because we are naturally inclined to do things that we feel, we chase our feelings. But the whole core of Bayesian bodybuilding is that we let reason, not feelings, guide your training. So don't worry about the pump, soreness, whatever. Trust in the science, and you'll get jacked. All right. All right. Okay, 5 minutes for questions. Yes.
You mentioned Katsu, and we know there are cases of Rieto with it, and even the one who developed Katsu got Rieto from it.
Mm-hmm.
And like 3 months ago, I was at thank you, at a seminar of Gerrit van der Poel, and I think you know that man.
Yeah.
Yes, all right. And he said like you have the very same effects and muscle growth with very slow reps and low weight. So let's say we do a unilateral leg extension. So why would I use Katsu with the danger of rehab though instead of super ultra slow reps with light weights, like also 30% of the RM?
All right, so basically why use Katsu when you can also just do really slow repetitions and then use a lighter weight? I think like for injury management, I think both are viable methods up to a point, because there's also good meta-analysis by Brad showing that, especially when you get to the super slow Fred Hahn kind of thing, then, you know, we see that it's probably not as effective anymore. The only effects where that seems to be somewhat, or the studies where it seems to be somewhat effective are when you use really low loads, and it's just that it's the only way to make that load anywhere near challenging. So it can work for rehab, but we actually know that blood flow restriction is exceedingly safe and a very viable method for rehab. So when you can use it, I think it's a really good call, and certainly not mutually exclusive with using a more controlled tempo, but they both have their use, by the way. So they're not mutually exclusive.
The rehab part were like clinical cases, and it's yeah, right. It's
right.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
What about attentional focus, or to use like a more bro-friendly word, mind-to-muscle connection? Because that's something I've been using the last 2 years, and that's made the biggest difference in hypertrophy for me and clients I train. We have studies as well showing like up to 25, I think, % increase in contraction. Brad has written some stuff, Brad Contreras. Yet I didn't hear a lot about that yet. Well, do you use it? Do you use like these cues? And because a lot of people I see, the reason they lack gains is because they do all the reps in a very mechanical way and not focusing, not feeling, and all that. So.
I think you certainly don't need to focus on any individual muscle, but attentional focus, so what you think about during training, can significantly influence your muscle recruitment pattern. So if you're doing biceps curls and you're thinking about your biceps, it might be possible to increase muscle activation levels there. But the problem with this is that you're also impairing performance. Try deadlifting your 1RM by thinking exclusively about engaging your glutes. It's not going to work.
It's not a tool for performance,
Yeah,
for sure,
right,
but for hypertrophy.
The thing is, if you're impairing performance, it might also impair growth in these other body parts. So I'm not really a fan. There's also some research showing that it doesn't really, once you're about 80%, 85%, you can think about your triceps all you want during a bench press, but you just need all the muscles to complete maximally to get maximum muscle activation levels. Otherwise, your weight just isn't going up. So I think it's a limited tool. It can be viable, but the mechanism there is just, if you think about your biceps, it increases muscle activation levels, which allows you to get higher mechanical tension levels, which can induce further growth. So I think it can be beneficial, but I'm not a big fan of it, especially not for compound work. Like for isolation work, it's generally what you want to think about, especially if it helps you maintain good technique, because if you're swinging the weight up, you might not be maximally involving your biceps anymore during a curl. So I think the mechanism, the key point for this lecture, is that it's muscle activation that drives growth from it.